And thank you very much for joining us here on PM Express. You may have heard about that big conversation that we've all been having over the last, 1 week. We broke the story about the neutrality, the so-called neutrality allowance. You've heard about it. You've heard the conversations about the compensation that government has agreed to pay the civil and local government staff for staying politically neutral. But what we haven't explored is the anatomy of the neutrality allowance itself, because it's so fundamentally a constitutional question. And it goes to the heart of the civil service, the public service, and why the thinking even came about that we should compensate them for it. And so you know by now that CLOCSAC, which is the association that is made up of the civil servants and the local government staff, they have called a strike and they are still on strike. We're expecting a press conference tomorrow on this, whether they're going to call off the strike or not, because they've been meeting with government. Government agreed to pay them the neutrality allowance. This is an allowance paid to them so that they remain politically neutral, right? And government agreed to pay them. The government is in 3 months arrears because government has failed to pay them that amount, and that's why they've called the strike. That is 20% of their basic pay. That is a lot of money. If you earn 2,000 cedis, for example, that is 400 cedis on top of what you earn. And so you understand why they've been agitating for this. Now, as far as the government is concerned, there was a justification for the payment. And if you speak to the civil servants, they point to Supreme Court ruling on the matter, right? Now, we've been digging into this because there's a bigger conversation here that we need to have about what we do to our civil service and public servants when they get into that position. There's an argument I've heard about rights, that it's their right to join a political party of their choice and exhibit same if they want to. So if you take the rights away from them, and then what do you expect? You have to compensate them for depriving them of a right. Is that what it really is? Let's go to the constitutional provision that has become topical. It is Article 94.3b, and it lists a number of institutions that, in essence, are barred from active politics. And these institutions, if you are a member of this institution, you cannot be eligible to be a member of parliament. And it has been interpreted to mean you cannot even be part of a parliamentary primary, for example, and you cannot also attend and show and wear your political colors in your office. The Supreme Court had cause, because it's gone before the Supreme Court before, to interpret this, which is a fundamental judgment that the civil servants have been pointing at. So Article 94.3b says, a person shall not be eligible to be a member of parliament if he is a member of the police service, if he's a member of the prison service, the armed forces, the judicial service, so judges, of course, cannot be partisan, the statistical service as well, the fire service, the customs, immigration service, as well as the internal revenue service. These are agencies that are banned. In 2015, two individuals who wanted to contest in the NDC primary were sued at the Supreme Court because of this particular provision. And the plaintiff wanted the Supreme Court to interpret this particular matter. That these two individuals, they don't qualify to do so because they are employees of the GES. One was an employee of the GES. The second was an employee of the Ghana Highways Authority. And that those two cannot run for the primaries. The Supreme Court actually disagreed. The Supreme Court actually said that there's a difference between the civil service and the public service. And the civil service are those who are employed by the civil service. And that's the list I've just read for you from the Constitution. But these individuals, by virtue of their employment at the Ghana Education Service and the Ghana Highways Authority, can do active politics. The interesting thing, though, about that is, although the Supreme Court is very clear on this matter, the Public Services Commission then subsequently issued a directive that said that people in the public servants, in GS and others, if they really wanted to do active politics, they should resign. And many have said that flew in the face of the Supreme Court judgment. As a result of that, there was a conflict. And so the point has been made that that's what the Public Services Commission, which again is a constitutional body, says, and you're depriving me of my ability to express my constitutional right to join the political party of my choice, then of course you have to compensate me for that, because the Supreme Court has said some of us can, and you said, well, you cannot. So there's a very interesting dynamic here, beyond everything you've heard about the fight that needs to be addressed, right? And we'll do so tonight on PM Express. But yeah, that's just me. There's a bigger question about how much this is going to cost us. The state has said we can't afford this. It's the reason why there's been a delay in the arrears of 3 months, but the government agreed to pay. So once you've agreed to pay and you sign an MOU, you must pay. Well, tomorrow we'll hear what the outcome of the negotiations are, because Clocksec had called for a press conference. So you can track. We are spending a lot on compensation. Total expenditure, if you compare to compensation, for example, you see that compensation has been climbing systematically to its highest yet in 2021 of 30 billion. We're talking about 35.8 billion this year. Of course, for the first time, we've seen that and we've seen the Deputy Finance Minister say it is unfair that 700,000 people take all that much. And then you have, on top of that, 20% of their salaries in neutrality allowance. That is a rip-off, as you've heard others say. I didn't say it. You listen to Franklin Kujo, who says it's fraudulent. You've listened to Dr. Emmanuel Akwete, who is my guest tonight, by the way, say it is corrupting and unethical. And Dr. Emmanuel Akwete is my guest tonight. Doc, thank you for your time here on PMS. I'm delighted that you could join me on this all-important conversation, which has been sparked over the last few days, indeed. And Doc heads the Institute of Democratic Governance and has some very interesting thoughts to share with us on this all-important matter. With this background that I've introduced, I'm looking forward to hearing his thoughts on this. Also joining us tonight is Nayeli Adefio, who is the Public Relations Officer of the Trade Unions Congress. Why is the TUC important in this conversation? The TUC had said over the weekend that they are also demanding neutrality allowance for members, for workers in 36 other public sector institutions, right? So that is interesting. We'll hear that, because if you look at the definition, there's a difference between a civil servant and a public servant. So really, are they justified to make that demand? We'll come to that. But I'm also grateful that we can speak to Dr. Nana Ato-Arthur. He is the head of the civil service, and I'm delighted that he also joins us on PM Express. In fact, I want to start with Dr. Nana Ato-Arthur when we return from this break. Stay with me. Very interesting conversation indeed. I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts of Dr. Akwete, TUC's Nayeli Adefio, and of course the head of the civil service, Dr. Nana Ato-Arthur. Thank you for staying with me here on PM Express. My guest joining me is Nayeli Adefio with the TUC. He speaks for the TUC. Also joining me is Dr. Emmanuel Akwete, and of course, Dr. Nana Ato-Arthur, head of the civil service, is also my guest. Dr. Ato-Arthur joins us on phone right now. I want to start with you, Dr. Arthur, and I'm grateful that you could join us here on PM Express. I'm curious, before I even go into any other detail, just to get your thoughts on this neutrality allowance debate that we've had in the last few days. Hello, Doc.
Yeah, hello.
Can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arthur, for joining us. I'm just curious to know, first of all, what your thoughts are on this very controversial matter of the neutrality allowance as a head of the civil service.
Thank you very much. Let me say that I'm the head of local government service.
Sorry, forgive me. Head of the local government service, yes.
My big brother, Ajikun Jamina, is the head of civil service. But to come to your question, I'm happy that you used controversial. I must admit, we've all agreed that it is a bit controversial. For that matter, the government, her engagement with the CRUSAC executive in the presence of myself and the head of civil service and others did indicate that that controversial terminology, that controversial nomenclature, neutrality, doesn't sit well with government. And for that matter, the last Friday that we met, government has come out to say, yes, we are okay to go with the allowance, the percentage increase, but we are not going to go with that nomenclature. So go back, let's sit down, look at how we're going to christen it, but we are committed to give you civil service staff, local government service staff, that allowance. That was the first thing that we agreed upon. Number two, the government is saying that closer, you know, the economic challenges that we are facing. Yes, although we signed a memorandum of understanding with you that that allowance was going to be implemented effective February, we cannot. We are pleading with you. Understand the situation that we are in today, and that we're going to start at the last quarter of the year, beginning October. And thankfully, the process executive agreed. And so, as we speak now, the agreement is that instead of February 2022, it is going to take effect from October 2022. That was what we all agreed upon last Friday. However, what was left was that the Minister for Employment and Labor Relations, who chaired the negotiation, was to write to the Minister of Finance. The Minister of Finance will then communicate to the Controller Accountant General's Department, copy to the CROSAC executive, so that the CROSAC executive will call off the strike. I am told that later by tomorrow, that letter will get to the controller, copied the CROSAC executive for the strike action to be called off.
So you're no longer calling it neutrality allowance. What's the new name? What's the new name for the allowance now?
We haven't gotten there yet. Okay. Since it is going to take effect from October, we have a long way to go. So that committee that's been put in place will be looking at the new name.
Okay. But it's still going to be 20% of their basic pay. That hasn't been touched.
That hasn't been touched.
Sorry, Dr. Arthur?
That hasn't been touched.
That hasn't been touched. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So that's the very latest on this. Please stay with me. Let me bring in Dr. Emmanuel Akwete. Doc, so they're changing the name because, as Dr. Arthur says, the way it was couched earlier was problematic, was controversial. They haven't found a new name for it yet, but at least it was something that was agreed before that now being changed because of the issues that everybody had raised, including yourself, I know. Does that necessarily address the fundamental issues that I know you have with this? Hello, Dr.
Thank you, Vance.
Yes.
I'm just not sure what government is doing then. So what is the pay for? He says they haven't decided the name. Can he describe it? What then is being done? Maybe to find the right name. The description will lead us to the correct name. Because I think what has raised issues and the public is not happy about is the whole notion of neutrality. Now he says it's not neutrality. So what is it? Because I think that would inform the discussion. I know Dr. Atta is my good friend, but this one, I don't understand what they're paying for then.
Doc,
are they
right.
shopping
I mean,
around to find out what they should pay for? Because
So stay with me, Doc. Let's see if we can
go on,
give us
please.
some clarity on that point. I mean, Dr. Arthur, so we are paying still. So what is it exactly that we are paying for, as Dr. Kwete?
Government has realized that looking at the salaries of civil servants, local government service staff, there's a need to jack up their allowances. And I can tell you that this was not just yesterday. These negotiations were concluded as far back as October last year. So it's like the government has realized that they needed to really respect CLOSAC, their demand. So CLOSAC had a number of allowances that they thought government should consider for them. And finally, they said, look, you can't just come with all these allowances singularly, this, and that. Put them together. And that came with that name, and we've all agreed with that. That controversial neutrality allowance. And so now you're asking me, what is it for? What it is that government realized that civil servants, local government service staff need some level of allowance. And that is what government has agreed upon with the CLOSAC executive.
Okay, but Doc, I guess the fundamental question is, so government agrees you deserve an allowance, fine. Initially when we negotiated, we said you deserve an allowance for being politically neutral. Okay, that then becomes an issue. We're not going to call it that anymore, but there must be a reason why you compensate somebody, definitely, beyond the agreement that you deserve it. There must be a basis for it. I guess that's what we are trying to...
There is a basis.
Okay.
Government knows how much she pays civil servants. Government knows how much she pays local government service staff. And so, after all the negotiations, government said that, yes, we accept that, look, civil servants who are directly with ministers every day, local government service staff who are directly with regional ministers and the chief executive, we have come to your level. President will say, we have come to your home, and that this is what we want to do for you. Forget about how it's going to be called. The controversial name, yes, I agree. But then the content wouldn't change. What the government said is that, look, February, we cannot do that. Forget about February implementation. We're going to plead with you that let's go into October. But it doesn't change what government agreed with CLOSAC executive. That is the point.
Dr. Kwete, does that sufficiently address your question?
I think, my dear friend, Doc is
Doc, I'm listening to you.
me. So should I call it underpaid allowance or a top-up allowance? That there is a certain level. Yes, there's a certain level of payment they're entitled to. And over the years, it's been overlooked. And so there has been a discussion and said the proper rate to be paid is this. And that is that in the past, they were underpaid. So would you call it, is it a top-up? How did neutrality come in? I mean, because it's far-fetched. If you're looking at, they've not been paid enough. For instance, when I spoke on Friday, I felt that, well, over time, they should be paid. But if the basic rate of payment was miscalculated, was that a mistake? Or because it's just for government to say, oh, okay, I realize you are paid too little, so I'll increase your, salary or allowances. What if others also other organizations or employees of government said, but we're all in the same situation. How is government going to handle that? I think the neutral, yes.
No, I'm following your ad, but let us also look at the build-up of various pay structures of organizations in Ghana. Years back, it came out that we're all going to go onto the fair wages salary scale. But I can tell you that within the public service, some are on the fair wages salary scale, others are not. Let's look at the build-up. Look, you teach a lot of students. Graduates come out from Legon, KNUST, and others. Some begin their entry points at local government service, civil service, at less than 2,000 Ghana cedis a month. The same public service, those who are not on fair wages salary scale, start at 3,000, start 4,000. How do you differentiate? How do you really understand this? So government realizes that, yes, let's look at civil servants, local government service staff again. We're not going to see a new salary structure, but we think that you need some level of allowance, and that is the allowance that we're going to give to you. Earlier on, thought that if you use that controversial neutrality, it was going to be unique to civil and local government service staff. But government comes back to say that, look, this doesn't sit well with us. We're not going to touch that percentage. Sit down, think about a new name, a new terminology, a new nomenclature. That is where we are now, Doc. That is the position.
Yeah, Dr. Kwete.
It seems to me that, okay, so government accepts that their salary is at too low a level.
Right.
And therefore, they should bring them up to a certain level compared to what? You see, or is this for justice? There's some injustice being done there. In which case, you would have had several other names to use. Okay, so I think that is for me where it is. If they're underpaid and they deserve, given comparatively to other civil servants or public servants, and they said, no, this has not been reviewed, and it's the lowest. And so for purposes of being fair, given the work they do and so on, they should go up. Then I think somebody must be terribly wrong to then describe that as, neutrality. When as a matter of fact, they are underpaid. And what was the comparison? I am just thinking that, how did they compare that? Is it with salaries in other countries? Is it in the same, well, you're making a distinction between the civil service and the public service, and there is some unfairness or injustice or inflation, or certain changes have occurred, which makes this hard-working civil servants unfairly treated. So there is justice being done, isn't it? And so why don't we use any of those terms? But also, why is it that you are still working on finding the right terminology? I mean, they are entitled, if indeed you are not paying them well, and they are so hardworking and deserve to be paid well, then why is it difficult to find a term? I just think that that's where the problem is. I think it's a good thing if government is in a position to increase their salary for work done, the number of hours they spend. The justifications usually ought to be there for salary increments. And in this case, I don't know, but yeah, I get the point you're making, except that searching for the right title should not be so difficult if they are underpaid, and that the basic minimum they get ought to be topped up for fairness and acknowledgement of their hard work. You see, the neutrality thing brings in politics, which is why the debate came about. If you don't pay me well, I'll join politics, or I'll be partisan, political, so that I can get more money. This is how the reaction started. That the essence of public service or civil service is your neutrality to serve everybody equally. But we know that that may be theory. So I think, well, I hear what Doc is explaining it. It said that, how was it determined? When did that realization happen? I think that government needs to explain this much clearer.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's not come through yet.
Dr. Arthur, let's try and track back. I mean, although you say that nomenclature will change, there's an MOU that has been signed that still bears the nomenclature neutrality allowance. Let's go back. When the negotiation started last year, and Kroczak and co were negotiating, it's clear to me from the deputy labor minister, employment minister, that there was an agreement in the room.
Yes.
That they deserve compensation for being politically neutral. I mean, forget about the name. Let's look at the substance behind the name. There was in the room in the negotiations, there was an agreement that because, in fact, I've heard the TUC and others make that argument, that because their right to be politically active have been deprived, then they should be compensated, which was a fundamental reason for then couching the term. But to the substance of it, Dr. Arthur, can we say that that substance hasn't changed, that the workers still are politically barred to engage in party politics, and that a certain right has been taken away from them?
Pursuant to a ruling by the Supreme Court in June 2017, if a staff of local government service, if a staff of civil service, overtly, you cannot be seen to belong to a political party, overtly. And they define the indicators how somebody is seen to be overt. Going for political party programs, wearing political party t-shirts, having posters like Atwata contesting on a ticket of political party, Commander Negua, Brave, Kikos, and whatever. Those things are there. That is what it still stands. That whether with that allowance or with that allowance, civil servants, local government service staff are to be neutral. But let me say this. You see, for the sake of argument, someone asked me, and I believe Doc is listening, somebody asked me that before you join the civil service, before you join the local government service, you knew that you were going to be neutral. So why the neutrality allowance? But my argument is this. Before somebody joined the police service, before somebody joined the military, they knew that that work was going to be risky. Why did they demand risk allowance? So if you want me to argue in that line, I'll argue in that line. Why are they demanding risk allowance? Not just demanding, but why are they paid risk allowance? So I do not want to really argue on neutrality since it doesn't say to our government. I don't want to go there. But for the sake of argument, you work with GBC, there's something they call is it transmission or radiation allowance. Before you joined the GBC, you didn't know that there was going to be radiation in the studio. But does everybody work in the studio? But when we are GBC, there's radiation or something allowance. So let's really think about the civil servants, the local government service staff, who really make government work really, 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 really effective and efficient.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Arthur, thank you very much. Stay with me. Dr. Akwete, that's the point, right? I mean, really, if you look at it, He has a point, has he not?
He does. It's just that this terminology of neutrality then was such a huge mistake, to put on the table. But in any case, let's look at context. Okay, there is a feeling, and it's a belief that the civil service in the Fourth Republic has been politicized. And that politicization comes from the mistrust that the political parties who come to government have towards working with the professional civil service. I mean, they are trained to work with their ministers or, other political leaders, irrespective of the identity of their parties or their membership, because they are serving the public interest, the public good. But increasingly in the Fourth Republic, this notion that ministers want to work with people sympathetic to their party's political philosophy, ideology has gained grounds. I mean, the chief director, for instance, there was a time that President Mills, for instance, was fighting against the pressure he came under. The late President Mills, may he rest in peace, was fighting against the idea that, he should remove all chief executives who are not NDC or were appointed by NPP. And he stood his grounds and said, no, these are highly trained, qualified, technical. They understand the work and we need them, and he wouldn't move. And he said, what if they all got out? Who are we going to work with? So the importance of the public service, and the civil service lies in their professionalism and neutrality. Sometimes it is difficult to separate the two on purely professional grounds, because they would always work with different leaders of different political parties, mandated by the people to lead and to come and push through higher levels of development and, for that matter, standards of living. But I think we've gone a little bit low in that, and there's a strong belief of politicization. So, I am not doubting what Dr. Atuata is saying, but I think the context matters. There is really a widespread feeling that the civil service of today is not the civil service we had in the 70s, but that since the 70s and over the decades in between, the neutrality of the service has been sacrificed. And I thought if that is what they are trying to resolve in building a strong professional civil service that says, my duty is to serve Ghanaians or any other, irrespective of their political identity. I mean, that is fine. Then we have to ask ourselves, how are you doing it? Is it money that will give you that or not? Or is it some training? Is it some standards, professional standard, qualification? For example, Singapore has one party. There are other opposition parties, but they're very weak. But to get into the civil service in Singapore, what defines you is your qualifications and constant exams every year. I don't know if it's changed. I used to be active in the Commonwealth Public Servants and Civil Servants Association also. And I met Singaporean leaders who said, look, your professionalism is your competence, it's merit. If you write exams and you fail, you go out. If you pass, you stay on and you are promoted. And nothing is guaranteed until you get to a higher level. So one would expect that if indeed government wants to deal with this problem, and I think Minister Doc would, as head of the local government, would admit that we are having problems with politicization of institutions, which we've suffered under or experienced under the Fourth Republic on both MPP and NDC sides. But it's a noble thing to attempt to build a strong professional civil service with ethics, with training, and sufficiently sufficiently paid, but also that they themselves are subjected or exposed to exams, annual this, annual that, to prove their competence and to upgrade themselves. And if in all this, they deserve to be paid well because the quality of services they provide, the utilization of the taxpayers' money to provide the services needed in the rural areas, in the local communities, and so on, and they are fighting corruption and all that, there's nothing wrong with that. That's rather commendable.
Yeah.
But I think for the public, the worry is the denunciation of neutrality as a neutrality allowance. I mean, they have to be neutral.
Yeah.
So where does the allowance come in?
Yeah.
Could the allowance take the form of not just pay increase, but probably other benefits or even training, improving their professionalization, equipping them well to do the work they are doing, and so on. So I think that has not been explained by simply dropping neutrality.
Yeah,
I think that's where the problem is.
I want to bring in...
What is the... Does the government care about...
I want to quickly bring in the TUC.
Okay, yes, please.
I want to bring in the TUC's Naile Adefio. He speaks for the TUC. Naile, apologies. I know you've been there we're trying to address the connection to you, but I understand that we can talk to you now. And I bring the TUC in because Naile Adefio, this past weekend, I had Dr. Kwabena Nyako Otu, who is a director of labor research and policy with the TUC, emphasize that they also expect this same allowance. Now we know that the name has been changed, but fundamentally, this same allowance will be paid to workers in 36 other public sector institutions. I wonder whether the explanation we've gotten tonight from the head of the local government service, does that change that demand that the TUC put forward, or you believe that allowance that has now been reclassified, it still must be extended to these other workers in the other agencies?
We're basically talking about the public service as well as the civil service, isn't it?
Yes.
I think that is what we're looking at. And for me, really, the explanations back and forth don't change the substance in the main. So whether you call it a neutrality allowance or however else you want to call it, for me, really doesn't change the substance of it. So for me, those are the things we need to look at, and I think we are where we are because of the point that agreements are reached. And I think, and not just this government, but succeeding governments have reneged on their responsibility implementing most portions of these allowances. And that is where we are today. So I mean, if we want to look at the issues, we ought to go back to the history of it. And you have 1,001 collective bargaining, not collective, negotiations with governments, and it is difficult to always have these agreements implemented to the letter. Just one small portion is what Dr. Akwete referred to, training and retraining. Ought we not train and retrain our public service and civil service in the areas they're working with, simply because there are trends that are current? There are trends coming up. Trends are changing every now and again, just to make them be on top of the duties they perform. So these are things that we ought to look at, broadly, so that we don't bog ourselves down to maybe semantics with names and all those. So for me,
do I get the clarity?
If the TUC is demanding,
do I get the clarity that whatever they call it, whatever they end up calling it, TUC's position
It
is
the
that
substance
extended
of
to
it.
all other workers in the other public sector institutions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely, because the point was made, the reference was made of GBC, for instance, radiation allowance. And then I have worked in GBC before, so I know about night and risk allowances. You have people working the whole night through and moving out of work or onto the job or into the office or into the studios at night when everybody is asleep. If you didn't give them night allowance, or they were working with machines, or they were working with transmitters, etc., that we know has high levels of radiation. If you didn't give them that, what would you give them? And so we need to look at the specifics, and then we can ascribe whatever compensation there is to it. I mean, we have had situations where workers, for instance, are taken for granted, and it gets to a point that you as an ordinary worker say to yourself, no more of this. Whatever name is put to it, whatever or however it is termed, there are substances to these things, and that is what we need to look at. If people have worked and they deserve for you to give them a risk or neutrality or however you want to call it, please, let's go to the substance of the issues and stop putting names to them.
Dr. Arthur, please let me clarify something with you from what the TUC spokesperson just said there. This agreement to start paying later, regardless of what you call it, is that applying only to CLOCSAC members or to everybody else in the public service?
I'm the head of local government service. CLOCSAC has a negotiation with the government. Civil and local government services are part of the public services of Ghana. CLOCSAC doesn't speak for all the public services of Ghana. CLOCSAC speaks for, it's a mouthpiece of civil and local government services. So my understanding is that it's only for the civil and local government services. But let me quickly go to the professionalism that my good friend Doc talked about. Look, today, if you go to civil service, if you go to local government service, staff are signing performance contracts, all geared towards efficient and effective service delivery. So the civil service of yesterday is not the same as civil service of today. Professionalism, I agree with Doc, is the key when you talk about local government service or civil service. And so when you look at indicators measuring the thematic areas, when it comes to the performance contract in both civil and local government services, professionalism is always the key. And we talk about training and retraining, talk about regular promotion when your promotion is due and all those. All these are things that I believe weren't very, very, very clear in the olden days. So the service of yesterday is not the same as the service of today. We're talking about professionalism. We're talking about people, ensuring that we serve the government of the day. It doesn't matter which government is in power. That's the more reason why civil service has really grown to where it is today.
But Dr. Kwete makes a more substantive point about this perception, and I want to ask you, is it a perception or reality? There's a misperception that the public service, the local government service, has become politicized. That takes a bit away from their professionalism. You don't agree?
I agree with Dr. Kwete. That's a perception, but I think it's real. I'll give you an example. If a government comes to power and you appoint a chief director of a ministry to become a minister or deputy minister, then you are not really looking at neutrality of the service. You understand? I think that government of yesterday, government of today, we need to look at that area very, very, very well. But I don't think that if we continue doing that, for instance, if somebody who works in local government service, today the person is appointed as the chief executive, and then we are talking about neutrality. I mean, we need to be looking at some of these things. I believe that it's not very, very backward. We are making the perception more a reality, than just a perception.
Dr. Kwete, that he makes a point there. I mean, he says the reality is that's the reality, that the local governments have this politicization, that we need to look at it more closely because it's happening. We're pretending it's not. I mean, burying our heads in the sun doesn't necessarily, the fact that the person becomes political, does it take away from their professionalism?
I think you can be highly professional, but the moment you are tagged, in some of the industrial countries, you see, they would have people, civil servants who are known to be either social democrats or with the conservatives. But the training and the structures in place to supervise and see what you do, and that professionalism is stronger. And I think we've lost that here. I have friends who are civil servants who sometimes will tell you, not everybody. I think when the politicians come initially, this person is removed. Initially, used to be top civil servants, chief directors. And then it started going below chief directors and all that. And I think it tends to create a certain atmosphere of insecurity. And also, it discourages people who want to serve and are qualified and so on. And this system has to be found out, but the politicization is real. I mean, because of the nature of our parties, they haven't set out to be nation builders or strong institutions that will serve every Ghanaian. Your identity, political identity matters. It's still happening anyway. So I think that if the government has an agenda to say, look, let us build the professional civil service that we need or that existed, and let us make them define other standards that must be met or satisfied to stay in, and so on and so forth. And your performance is measured, you are guaranteed service. I mean, the guarantee was that you can't be removed politically until you've done something extremely bad, unprofessional to be removed. But now it doesn't matter. And I don't know the structures in place to protect civil servants and public servants if the politicians or the situation we've had since 1992, it's not really, there's no consensus between the two parties, especially in saying this is a professional class. So we are going to continue training them to perform professional and politically neutral, services. It doesn't mean they do not have political beliefs. They vote. So definitely, but they shouldn't wear the hat or let their decisions be determined by what party they are affiliated to. So are you this or are you that, and so on. And people are talking about it. They feel they'll be denied services they're entitled to because they are not seen to be this or that. I'll give you an example. I spoke to a few people who had been affected by, the COVID situation, lockdown. They couldn't trade, they couldn't. And then I said to them, well, the government is doing well. It's assisting you people. I mean, the Protect changing to. And some of them, this is their perception. I don't know the truth of it, said, well, we thought we were even in a situation given the kind of business we do, the investments we make to access the funds. But it wasn't given to us, and no explanation was given. You see, so there is this feeling, and you could even remember the lockdown and the feeding that went on. So there is this notion of politicization. Who are you, one of us or against us? Or let us deal with this first. Let's deal with these people first. And it's not based on an objective criteria, but political identity or affiliation or association. Yeah. That is what I think they should fight. Yeah. So for me, the neutrality allowance, the way it was thrown out there, and the withdrawal, rather suggests that government is really still hasn't come around to the idea of having to build a professional civil service that renders impartial services to citizens. Okay. And that neutrality is still a value.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akwete. Thank you also, Dr. Atuatha. Thank you, Naile Defi. Unfortunately, the connection to you wasn't that great, but I'm grateful that you joined us nonetheless to give us your thoughts on this very controversial matter. Enjoy the rest of your evening, ladies and gentlemen.